basically from now until the coffee break, we're going to be focused on the material that's in chapter 9. That we started on that chapter really just reviewing and presenting in a concise way what we had talked about up to that point in the book, and sort of providing an overview, a reminder of the kinds of work, and then the kind of connections. And this, at this point in the book, and by this point in the seminar, hopefully you all have a pretty clear idea of what's the overall frame, and then these 3 different kinds of work. We've also, of course, connected those with existing streams of literature. But in terms of self-work, organization work, and institutional work, there's, of course, many streams of literature that you could connect into those. These are just the ones that we chose to talk about in the book. Self-work, of course, is work done on a self. It could be you doing work on your own self. It could be your, university and people in the university trying to socialize you right now into being PhD students. That's self-work done by lots of different people, right? Organization work, that's work on actually building, changing, maintaining an organization. So that's really about what do we do to not just the organizational members, but also other organizations, the government, suppliers, customers, anybody really, any organizational actor, any individual actor who has a role in constructing an actual organization, a specific organization. And then institutional work, which is about things like categories and language and concepts, and that's the kind of societal, cultural level kind of software that we all have in our brains, and that we use in these other kinds, we draw on these other kinds of work, and I'll come back to that. But working on that means trying to change the way we think about gender, or trying to change the definition of a word, or the struggles and arguments that are going on all over the world around things that we've been talking about, around vaccine versus freedom, around pandemic, these kind of all kinds of institutional work are going around. What does this mean, and how should we think about it, right? What is these concepts? How do we suddenly are all experts on all kinds of stuff that none of us knew, well, most of us didn't know anything about before, in terms of all sorts of conceptual infrastructure for thinking about pandemics and viruses. That kind of level of stuff is all this easy kind of institutional stuff that people work on, because if they can change those, it has profound effects. And we gave you examples around race, around ethnicity. We talked about the guy who tried to change his age, which is still one of my very most favorite ones, because he thought he should be able to be a different age. We talked about all those things. I mean, the age is self-work. The conceptualization of age, that is, of course, institutional work if you're trying to change that. So the degree to which he was trying to argue we should think about age differently, he was doing institutional work. The degree to which he was saying I should be able to be at a different age, that's self-work. Okay. Do you want to add anything to that, Tom? Is there anything in terms of the warm-up? Is that okay?
No, that's great.
Okay. So what I'll talk about a little bit now is the opportunities that arise around this kind of conceptualization of social symbolic work and social symbolic objects. In particular, I'm going to talk about 2 things. I'm going to talk about the way in which we can think about combining different forms of social symbolic work, and how that produces research opportunities that we can focus on. I'll give you some examples of that. And then the opportunities that emerge when we think about the connections between different social symbolic objects, right? And the way that people, individuals and organizations act to shape those connections. So we'll start with the first one, which is thinking about different kinds of social symbolic work and how they're combined in situations, and then move on to the second part, which is the way objects are connected together, and the way actors work on those connections. Okay. We've purposely oversimplified. So in the big first, whatever the 8 chapters of the book, we purposely ignored something that's completely obvious, which is that all the time when people are acting, they tend to be doing complex mixtures of different kinds of social symbolic work, and they tend to be aimed at more than one social symbolic object, right? So this is really purposeful, but also overly simplified, right? It's not very realistic, and it doesn't really, when we're actually looking at doing real research, it's actually quite helpful a lot of the time, not always. Sometimes it's perfectly appropriate and useful to do that same move and simplify and focus on just one social symbolic object or just one type of work. That's completely fine. But there's a lot of research opportunities and a lot of let's say if you're interested in certain kinds of general problems, then you really need to have a more complex conceptualization of the ways forms of social symbolic work interact and the way social symbolic objects are connected together, right? So if we go back to this old picture that we talked about right near the beginning, any discussion of this, you suddenly see that this one action, putting this car into space, is actually many different kinds of social symbolic work. And there's a lot of social symbolic objects impacted by this, right? So when I look at this, of course, you immediately think, oh, self-work. This is Elon Musk working on his self. But of course, it's not just Elon Musk. He has a whole team and multiple companies that are involved in this. They're all working on Elon Musk's self, right? But then there's also the organizational work. This is about both the space company, whatever it's called, SpaceX, and also Tesla, the car company, right? And we could go on and on and on. The point is that in this one action, there's a multitude of interesting stuff going on. Yeah? Oops. So let's talk a little bit about this and think a little bit about this. And we go back to this picture, and we can make it a lot more, we can sort of this kind of picture in these kind of categories of motivations, practices, resources, the effects that come out, the things that actually happen. And in this central box, what we want to put is, instead of social symbolic work, a particular kind, or organization work, or self-work, or whichever, would say, actually, we can make this a lot more rich by putting in different kinds of social symbolic work, mixing them together. Don't have to. We can focus on one, but there's some really interesting stuff that we can see when we mix these things together, right? And so then the motivations suddenly become motivations to do a combination of social symbolic work, because we're hoping for effects in multiple different ways, right? Suddenly the practices, we're combining practices to do this because we're trying to impact multiple different social symbolic objects, for example, right? And we need more complex set of resources, and the situation around this that's shaping this action suddenly also becomes a bit more complex. So this is a move that I think Tom and I from the beginning thought this is actually much more interesting. And part of the reason we wrote the book and wrote the original paper way back when 2012 or whatever it was to say, actually, you guys are all talking about these different kinds of work. There's lots of really interesting stuff that happens when you combine them together. And that's what one of our primary purposes was, to create a framework to make it easier to do that. To say, these different kinds of work, identity work, boundary work, whatever, values work, all kinds of work, millions of kinds of work. Now, they're actually all kinds of the same thing. And looking at their connections actually isn't as complicated as maybe it seems when you first start thinking about it. It's really interesting to talk about how these things connect together, right? So that's really where we wanted to get to, and in the book, where these are the last couple of chapters, is saying, look, this is really interesting. We have this framework, this way of thinking, and actually connecting these things together now produces lots of interesting and previously not as easy to see topics for research. Did you want to add something, Thomas?
There's just a question in the chat, just to clarify, around the role of the concept of practices in this diagram. The question is, when you mention practices in this illustration, do you mean the same practices that actors can shape by institutional work? And I guess the answer is kind of yes and no, in the sense that what we're saying is that, and when we talked about practices last time, we think of all forms of work as drawing on repertoires of practice that already exist in social arenas. And so the way you do emotion work, or the way you do boundary work, and so on, draws on existing practices. And that's how you enact those practices in doing those forms of work. At the same time, those practices are institutions that could be the target of work as well. And so there's a recursive relationship that practices has in this diagram implicitly that we don't make explicit. So I hope that helps.
and there are some kinds of practices. In this picture, these are practices that inform social symbolic work. So the practices that people use on an assembly line building a car are not useful as parts of social symbolic work. They're really super useful to build a car, right? But there's other sets of practices which are about how we change organizations or change selves or change institutions. And those over time develop. Some of them, people come up with new ways. So at a certain point when social media became a thing, then people figured out, oh, we can use social media to impact institutions. And a set of practices developed and people learned from each other. And there's now a set of practices. You can become a social media influencer, and you have a standard set of practices that you draw on. They're highly institutionalized, but you might invent some of your own. You might come up with some special little things that you do, and those are your practices. Those aren't widely known, so they're not institutionalized in a broad sense. But they're practices that you habitually use, and then maybe some other people pick up, and if they do, and it becomes broadly spread out. This box here isn't all practices of all kinds. It's practices that are useful in doing social symbolic work. Right? Does that make sense to everyone? Hopefully it does. Okay. Yeah, well, feel free to keep typing hard questions, Tom. I like that. It's much easier just going through the slides than having to deal with you guys in chat. So a couple of examples maybe that will help. And this is a paper that I wrote with Paul and Elena Delpiaz, my colleague at Imperial. And this is a paper looking at a family business, Alessi. So some of you may have some Alessi bits and pieces. I have this kettle. This is my favorite kettle in the world. It's really cool. It's also really loud, but that's, it's a long story about the whistle, but that's anyway. And the thing that the gentleman is holding at the bottom there is and that is the guy that this paper's about, is actually, I could ask you to guess what it is, but if you haven't seen it before, it may not be obvious. It's a citrus juicer. So if you have yeah, very good, Michelle. Yeah, so if you've seen it before, the first time I saw it, I was really unclear what that was for until I caught on after a bit. Oh, I see, it's for lemons, and the juice runs down and drips off the point down there. It's very clever. So this is a really interesting company, Alessi. Alessi started out, it's a company located in northern Italy. We all think of it, if you're familiar with the company now, you think about it as this kind of company that makes these cool things for the house, kettles, all kinds of high design, reasonably expensive, but not too expensive. And the way they talk about it as kind of industrial art, right? It's industrial art, right? It's like this kind of industrially produced, so it's reasonably inexpensive, but it's art, right? And that's kind of this, and that was this gentleman's kind of addition to the company. And what was very interesting is the company was founded, and then the company was taken over by the son of the founder. And this is the nephew of the second CEO, I think, if I remember the story. It doesn't matter exactly. And when he went to become CEO, it was a bit of a challenge, because you have a couple, in a normal company, what you do when you change CEOs is the new CEO just talks about how terrible the old CEO was. So everything is the old CEO's fault. And there's actually a paper in ASQ written by Bob Gephardt about this, about how the normal way, when there's a transition of leadership, the new leaders just talk about how terrible the old leaders are, and that's how they legitimate themselves, is in comparison by delegitimizing the preceding leaders. And then over time, the preceding leader may be brought back and legitimized again once the new leaders are in place. But you can't do that when it's your uncle. You can't say how crap your uncle was. So this whole paper was about how they managed to construct an identity for this new leader as a leader and as someone should be leading the company. And his program, which was to take a company but basically made industrial quantities of silverware, of various things that were really for restaurants, for catering, and turn it into this company that created these objects. And what they did is created some stories. So it was narrative identity work, but it was self work in terms of this gentleman and his identity, or his self, that he was the person who should be leading. He was the right one to take over, to continue on with his uncle's project, but simultaneously reconstructing the company as an organization to be something that focused on this art. And so what we studied there is these two kinds of work simultaneously. Work on this individual as someone who's taking over as CEO, and that they were what they were, who they were, and why being CEO was a great next move, even though he was going to take the company in a very different direction. So they also had to reconstruct the history of the company to make this turn actually seem like a logical next step. And so we studied this as a really interesting example of very careful narrative construction of an individual who was going to be the CEO and the company, to make this transfer of power legitimate, and also to make the new strategic direction seem like the great way to go without the old one being wrong. So we were basically studying organizational work and self-work and how they work together. Right? So this is an example of the kind of thing that Tom and I thought there was lots of opportunity to really think more clearly about. We didn't have this framework when we were doing this exactly. We didn't have this way of thinking so clearly about how these different things are actually both social symbolic work. Do you want to add anything, Tom? Or okay?
No, I think that's great, actually. And I think it'll become more clear even when you talk about the different sort of strategies for combining these things.
Yeah, okay.
So, no, that's great.
Yeah, so we have a set of kind of generic ways of thinking about how to combine forms of work. Right? And the three that we talk about in the book are sequencing forms of social symbolic work, aligning forms of social symbolic work, and integrating forms of social symbolic work. What do we mean by this? Well, sequencing means doing one after the other. So this is for example, doing identity work and then doing organizational work, or doing organizational work first and then identity work, or self-work, right? In terms of the paper that I just talked about, it's actually an example of the second one, which is aligning forms of work, which means doing them at the same time and in a way that's connected, right? And that's the Alessio example, the Alessi example. The Alessi example is really doing self-work and organizational work simultaneously and very carefully weaving them together so that the same statements were both social symbolic work on the individual and social symbolic work on the company, right? Sequencing, very much doing them in order, doing one, getting it to a certain point, getting it finished, and then doing another form of social symbolic work, right? So integrating work is having them happen at the same time. Integrating is really even putting them together and having them be this actually, maybe the Alessi example is a better example of integrating, which is making them actually the same action is actually doing both at the same time. So aligning, you're doing social symbolic work, two different kinds at the same time, but they're not necessarily the same actual action. Putting them together, making them, integrating them into one activity is this kind of integration of social symbolic work. Oh, do you want to add anything to that, Tom?
Well, just nothing to add except we're going to talk a little bit, sort of change directions a little bit, talking about how we connect objects. And I just wanted to there hasn't been questions in chat for the last minute or so. It's either completely clear or you're pausing. But one of the things we occurred to us around the strategies for combining forms of work is there's really very little in the literature on this. And so these are logical kinds of possibilities, but they could present real significant empirical kind of entry points for people.
Yeah, yes.
So if you have kind of more specific, concrete things you want us to talk about in relationship to them, that would be fine.
Yeah, and Cecile has a question. So self-work is work on a self. So it's the social symbolic object in that case is a self. So in this case of Alessi, the self is the CEO, and that self-work is his and his team and others external because this is quite a famous company, and as this was happening, a lot of people were writing about this move of Alessi into this market. They'd already made a lot of these objects that were quite artistic, but they were moving more. That's what they were going to do, is that as they were going to stop making the more pedestrian items that had been the core of their business, and actually move fully into making this industrial kind of art. And in that sense, he was working on his identity, his self, sorry, the organization, other members of his team, his marketing team, were all working on his self, who he was, why he was the right person, but also external commentators were writing about the company. So the self work is about a self, but it doesn't have to be you doing the work on yourself, right? It's about an individual self. Organization work, and this is where it gets a bit confusing, because if you're talking about the organization's identity, it's organization work, right? If you're talking about identity work at an organization level, if you're talking about identity work at an individual level, then it's self work, because the object is a self. Whereas if it's identity work at the organization level, the object is the organization. I don't know if that's clear. Hopefully that's clear. All right. And in the book, we give examples of these and different, and you look at hopefully the more you think about it and the things that you've done research on and other research projects. I mean, in the paper that Paul talked about, our paper with Keystone, I mean, there was lots of different kinds of work going on internally and externally. There's lots of kind of organizational work going on. What was the organization doing good, or was the organization doing bad? What was the organization, right? What was it doing, and how should we think about it? So there was external people who were criticizing the organization. There was internal people who were defending the organization. There's some internal people who were criticizing the organization's work with migrants, right? So there was a ton of different organizational work going on. And in the end, Neil, who was the CEO, I mean, his decision was that, even if some people were going to be unhappy, this was what they were going to be, and then he worked very hard to make it clear that this was aligned with the organization's values. And this was again more organization work, right? So yeah, that was going on. Some of it was one after another. It was sequenced. Some of it was aligned. It was happening at the same time, and some of it was integrated. It was one act of social symbolic work that was having multiple different effects, right, on different objects. Okay. Anything in the chat you want to talk about? This is quite important. So.
No, the only piece missing was just that relationship to the self as the concept of the self. And so, like we were talking about last time in terms of institutional work, when we think about the idea of the self, and we talked about the history on the first day, we talked about the history of the self as a concept across pre-modernity and modernity and post-modernity. We said two things changed simultaneously and relatedly. One was, how do we understand the idea of the self? And that's the institution of the self. And that informs and shapes how each of us works to shape ourselves and the other selves that we're trying to shape. And so, like Nelson said, I draw on concepts of the self in socializing PhD students. I draw on the concept of a PhD student. I draw on a number of institutions, but those are the conceptual kind of architecture within which we fashion concrete instances, which would be social symbolic objects as well. Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah, Sarah had a question which I think is useful to answer quickly, because I'm talking about CEOs, and she says, if you're trying to influence a CEO to create an organization change, is that organization work? Well, we would think of that as, I don't know whether we would call that organization work or not, depending exactly how you define it. I mean, we might just call that influencing, trying to get the CEO to do organization work for you. If the CEO does, I guess, because you're trying to influence him or her, then that would be an attempt at organization work, because if you've succeeded, then you would have had an impact on the organization. The one that's clear is the CEO. If you convince him or her that some change is required, and they actually change the policy of the organization that has an impact on the object that is the organization, they've definitely done organization work. Now, whether your influencing of the CEO's organization work is an interesting philosophical question. I don't even think I know the answer. Do you know, Tom?
Well, no, but I can link it to Rich's question, and I think it's important.
Oh, Rich's question. I didn't see Rich's question.
And so I think there's different things going on, and this is where we go back to how you define work in relationship to its outcomes or its intentions. And so for us, we define the target of work in terms of its intention. So the degree to which we're doing self-work is associated with the degree to which we're working to shape a self. And so the degree to which you are trying to influence the CEO in terms of who she or he is, how they construct themselves, how they understand themselves, how they present themselves. That could be a form of self work that would be going back to kind of maybe allied with organization work because you want them as a person to be more entrepreneurial and you want the organization to be more entrepreneurial. And so you might imagine doing both of those. At the same time, that might just be an unintended outcome of the organization work you're doing. You're trying to change the organization, and in doing that, you have spillover effects on the people that you're doing it with, and so on, and spillover effects on the CEO, but you're not really meaning to. And so, lots of things, innumerable things, shape institutions, shape organizations, shape selves. Some of those things are forms of work where people are trying to intentionally make those changes. And this is where Rich's question comes in around if I'm engaged in institutional entrepreneurship or institutional work, am I also doing self work? Because by being the one who performs institutional work, aren't I changing who I am? And again, I would say, well, possibly. You're undoubtedly, every experience you have, every dramatic kind of or effortful engagement you pursue probably changes you. Now, whether you're working to change yourself is a different issue. You could be. You could say, you know what, I want to, um, I want to start a business. That could be something you try and do, and that could involve a lot of organization work. You could simultaneously say, I want to be an entrepreneur. That's what I want to be. That's how I want people to understand me. That's how I want to understand myself. And so I'm going to read Elon Musk's biography and I'm going to try and mimic that version of an entrepreneur, whatever. And so that would be doing self work and organization work. Now, you could equally do not that. You could try and start a business that would have an effect on yourself, but you wouldn't be working on yourself purposefully, reflexively with that intent. That could just be an unintended consequence of that organization work. And so at this point, you're kind of going, wait, how do I ever pull all this stuff apart? My head's going to explode. And the point would be that when you look at concrete social work, you need to both engage with why people, not just the stories of what they say, why they're trying to do something. But so Willie Ocasio has this sort of phrase, the markers of intent. And so you can look and you can observe indications of people's intent as well as their own stories of intent to get at what they're trying to accomplish and what the effects of that. And that's why those are so separate in our box. And that's why we kind of pull out motivations and consequences as well as the work that's going on. Yeah, I'm going to stop there for a minute.
Yeah, in this one. Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that there's lots of effects of people's attempts at social symbolic work that are not what they intended. There's lots of times when people's different activities, people or organizations, different activities, actors' activities, come together and produce outcomes that none of the people that were intending what they were intending isn't what any of them what happened isn't what any of them intended. So there's lots of unintended effects. There's also lots of attempts at social symbolic work that simply don't have any effect. Right? The institutions or the organization or the person's self is too stable and too resistant to the attempts to change it. Right? And in those cases, there may not be much effect at all, but it was still an attempt because it was an intended, purposeful try to change a social symbolic object. Right? And yeah, it's complicated. So, and there's also the stuff that's happening around social symbolic objects. In the book, we talk about a couple of different ways to connect together, think about social symbolic objects, and think about what might be interesting to do research on around them and around their production, their change, the way they're changed, the way they're maintained. And this is the first one. Idea of enactment, and this is kind of using a social symbolic object to construct something else. So to make it real, so take an institution and live it, or make it real. The idea of a blockchain company, and so you set up and try to make a blockchain company. You actually make you create an organization, you get some funding, you buy some stuff, you get some people, and you try to make a blockchain company. That's enacting the idea of a blockchain company. Right? There's an example in the book we talk is a surgeon drawing on ideas of what a surgeon is to construct their identity, right? And there's lots of examples of that, because we have lots of deeply institutionalized ideas of particular professions, and people, as part of their professional training, they're taught those. So that's a really obvious one, where people try to live these professional categories, whether it's priest or surgeon or taxi driver in London. You take this complicated test, and you kind of drive around in a black cab, and you become this particular kind of person. It doesn't have to be done by signal acumen. You have whole organizations trying to become kinds of organizations, right? Or you can have can be at an organizational level. So it's just about taking some sort of institution, usually, and living it, becoming that, or making that, or constructing an actual version of that. Right? So that's enactment. Just like the name, I think, is fairly clear. You're acting out at some level. You're acting out a social symbolic object that is at a higher level. Is at this sort of institutional level, higher level. I shouldn't say that. It's not a very good metaphor. Abstraction is the reverse. So there's a pattern in the world. A pattern in a set of behaviors is about recognizing it, naming it, and abstracting it. Right? So something's happening. There's some sort of trend. There's some sort of activity, and someone comes up with a name, a selfie. People were taking pictures of themselves. People used to paint pictures of themselves. We didn't call it a selfie. But then at some point, because people taking pictures of themselves with their mobile phones where they could reverse the camera, suddenly became a very common thing to do. Someone noticed this was becoming a thing. And I think the way we say that, a thing, is really instructive. And as it became a thing, we named it. Well, we didn't. A guy in Australia did. There's actually a record of the first known use of the term selfie, and it was by an Australian. They're good at neologism, so that's not a surprise. Right? Of course, for it to catch on and become a social symbolic object, you don't just get to do it by yourself. It has to sort of catch, and lots of people have to start kind of repeating and sharing and duplicating until this kind of becomes understood as a concept, a thing, a category, right? across a whole social group. Okay? So we notice these patterns. Somebody somewhere offers often a word, but it doesn't have to be a word. It can be a phrase, a concept. It can be even a longer kind of piece of text that's often associated with it. Yeah? Not always. Could just be an understanding that this is a kind of thing, and it becomes this abstracted social symbolic object that then can be taken around and enacted in other locations. Right? So it's this iterative social process, and often you're going back and forth between abstraction and then lots of enactment, and that also causes it to be passed around and moved through and adopted across larger and larger groups of people. Translation, we really think that's both Tom and I've written a lot on translation and institutional theory. I've written on translation and institutional theory, and we built on those understandings of what translation is to think about social symbolic objects more generally, right? So taking a social symbolic object from one context and moving it to another context. An institution is one kind, so institutional sort of ideas of translation talk about one kind of social symbolic object, but there's other kinds of social symbolic objects that can be moved. So translation is just about moving social symbolic objects from one social context to another, from one culture to another, from one social group to another. Right? And we're really building on this literature, but this literature is very focused on just institutions, although that's a very easy way to think, very easy context to think about it. Right? An example of this is a great paper, can't remember her name, it's a great paper on creating Disney in France. So when the Disney Corporation opened in France and created Disney France, the trouble they had, right? Because they're creating an object, and what they wanted to do is just repeat what they have in the US. Of course, that didn't fit into France. It's not the idea of Disneyland. It was actually an actual organization, the social symbolic object, in this case, the organization. They created it, and then they had to edit it a lot. They had to start serving wine at Disneyland, at Disney World in Paris. They had to change, they had rules in the United States that no one could have any facial hair. Well, if no one had any facial hair, no one was going to work for them in France. So they had to be unionized, which was anathema for Disney. So a whole bunch of things had to be fundamentally changed. In that case, what they were translating was a company, translating a whole company from the US to there. Yeah? And there's the business model had to shift. That's why they started selling wine. No one would eat in France unless there was wine. So they had to start serving wine, which of course, from Disney's point of view, this is a dry place. So anyway, it's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, Tom's paying attention to I'm answering in the chat. That's not my role. I'm breaking the rules. Okay. Inversion, and this is really it's closely related to translation, I guess, in one sense, but it's taking especially an institution and inverting it. So taking something and fundamentally flipping the meaning, right? So this is kind of a form of social symbolic work to take something and make it mean not necessarily the opposite, but something very different than what it had meant before. Right? So the great example is queer, the label queer in the LGBT community, that this idea that this word, which was an insult, can be used self-identified because it actually can be made to mean something that is representative of a certain group in this community, at least. Right? So flipping this around. So this is in this we see, especially with institutions and categories, that their meanings can be flipped. It's a really kind of interesting sort of social symbolic work that produces these flips in meanings. Right? Oh, Tom, anything from the chats you want to add there?
I just want to add one thing, which is just to sort of step back one piece before the kind of different types.
Do you want me to go back on the slides?
Oh, no, it's fine. Just one idea that sort of unifies these different labels or ideas around connecting social symbolic objects. And one of the things we were really struck by, both in our thinking about the literature on social symbolic work across the different literatures and trying to kind of theorize the relationships between social symbolic objects, was the idea that what we didn't want to suggest was a kind of naive physics image of pool balls, balls on a pool table kind of clanking into one another and having effects. Because for us, what it seemed more like was what connected different social symbolic objects, if you looked at a scene or if you looked at the evolution of social symbolic objects, was forms of work. And so the connections between objects involved forms of work. And what we were trying to do with this list of 4 was enumerate or identify at least 4 kinds of work that seemed to us really important, not necessarily comprehensive by any stretch, but kind of answered the question of how would one object relate to another in some different ways. And so
Tom and I were doing a bit of abstraction.
we were doing a bit of exactly trying to come up with
we'll
some
see
kind
if
of
it catches on.
like.
Yeah, we'll see if it catches on. See if you guys like it or not. If you start
Yeah.
telling people about these, then we've succeeded. If not, it's
Then it
just
becomes
Tom
an
and I.
institution, or it doesn't become an institution. Exactly. So anyway, the point is, when we're going to get you to do an exercise shortly, but one thing to think about when you're doing it is that idea that if you think of a social situation or social scene as made up of objects, one of the questions you ask is, what's the work that's connecting those objects or relating them to each other? How are they informing each other through the work of people? That's all.
Okay, great.